In this video, I want to talk about the difference between parts, mesh parts, models, and union operations. So you should be pretty familiar now with what a part is. It's just a basic shape you can add in here. But what is a mesh part or union operation or a model? So this is a model, and you can see here it has a bunch of different parts in it. So the model will just serve the function of holding all these parts together. So you can see if I can move it, you see all the parts are moving. I don't have to move each individual part. I can just move them all because they're in a model. This is a mesh part, which is kind of like a model, but it's going to be a model from a 3D software program. So this would be created in something like Blender or 3D Max or something like that. So these are very nice if you need a lot of detail. If you need something with a lot of geometry, then you're going to want a mesh part. A mesh part can also be inside of a model. It's the same with a union operation. So, for example, I can just group this right here, and now it's inside of a model as well. If it's just one mesh part, then you don't need to do this, but if you had multiple mesh parts that you wanted grouped together, then you could just put them in a model. And then this is a union operation. So a union operation is just a joining of a bunch of parts, but instead of unlike a model, the parts are actually separate. A union operation just fuses them all together. A union operation is really nice because then if I want to change the color or something, it's very easy. I don't have to change each individual part like I would for this. I would have to select every single part and change it like that. But then the downside of that is that I can't change if I want it more specific, like if I just want this top part to be a certain color, well, I can't do that anymore because it's all just fused into one part. Unless I can separate it like this, you can see with the separate button, and now I can do it. So that's always an option. Now looking back over at the model here, a model also has various properties over here that a part won't have. For example, the primary part, with most of the time you want to set a primary part just because it makes things easier, especially if you plan on using scripting with the model. So the primary part will just kind of determine the origin point of the model. So I could just pick whatever I want to be the center point of the model. In this case, I probably wouldn't want it to be this, but I'm just showing you for example. So if I want to be able to move this with a script, for example, then I'm going to need to have a primary part selected. And that'll just kind of determine the origin point here. So now you can see if I set it to that part, now the model is going to pivot around this part. So if I rotate it, it's going to rotate around that position right there. And then if I don't have any, then it just uses, I thought it used the center. I guess it saves the pivot point, so I would just have to reset the pivot point then if I want it to be back in the center, just like that. So again, you could have any of these grouped as a model, but definitely if you have it just depends how many parts you have. If you just have one part, then you don't really need it grouped in a model. But if you have a lot of parts, then you probably want it grouped in a model. The other way to group it would be in a folder. So I could instead group this as a folder like this. But then the problem with this, you see, I can still move it and everything like that, but then the problem is I can't set a position. I can't change any of the properties of this because it's just in a folder. So you'd pretty much never want to do that, because with this I can actually change things. I can change the scale here, or the position. So there's really no reason to group it as a folder. Then looking at a few other differences, the mesh part can also use a texture. So instead of setting just a color and material here, I could use a custom texture to give it a lot of detail. And the mesh part can also scale on each axis separately. So I can just scale it this way if I want. And now you can see it's very, very thin. Or I can make it wider. Whereas with the model, I can't do that. You see, in this case, even though I'm just dragging the x-axis, it's scaling the whole thing down. And with the union operation, I can also do the same thing. I can just scale it on one axis like that. And I can also just set the color if I want, but for the union operation, I can't use a texture. So if you want a custom texture, then you want a mesh part. One last thing to consider when deciding between these options is with this model, with all these parts, these will all have to be welded together, unless I just want to anchor all of them. Otherwise, you can see when I run it, it's all just going to fall apart. So I would either need to anchor all of these or weld it. Whereas with these options, because these are just one part, I don't need to worry about welding it.